spaceship, right?
Here we go.
We're landing.
We landed. Start. Let's call this meeting of the CFC to order on May 15th at 6:31. Roll call, please.
Mr. Kowski,
Here.
Mr. Davis, Dr. Fiorenza,
Here.
Ms. Guerrero,
Here.
Mr. Henry, Mr. Imhoff,
Here.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Kohler, Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. Odell,
Here.
Dr. Sanders, here, Ms. Sedor.
Here.
Okay, the first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes from our last meeting, March 21st, 2023. Does anyone have any questions or changes to the minutes? I can review them and give you some corrections. If not, could I have a motion to approve?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Next item on the agenda are public comments. Lisa, do you have anyone?
None.
For public comments
None.
online or otherwise?
Nope.
Moving on then, our first discussion item is an update from the board on their decision regarding funding project two. Mr. Henry here, Tom, I think that's you.
This is one, great. So the board appreciated the input from the CFC and the three options. There was discussion on the student impact. There was discussion on the financial piece, and I think that a couple of key things that were, articulated. One was compliance with board policy 4:60, right?
That's debt.
4:20.
And it's
Fund balance?
Fund balance, yes, okay, so, just as an aside, the board did adopt the recommended 25 to 50% fund balance in a first read last week, so that's already been codified into the policy. The other element in the policy is the recommendation that the board operate under a balanced operating budget. And that was kind of a key element because in looking at the different options presented to us, the options that had referendum would be not necessarily, there would be increased fund balance and or operating outside of a balanced budget. One of the two would happen. Both, so in either you're quote unquote not adhering to that either by overspending or by building up a fund balance. So that was, from a financial standpoint, that was a key factor, and the board voted unanimously to pursue what was option 2, which was originally option 4, which was to utilize its own resources with debt certificates to fund project 2. So I will keep it short and field questions and anything that people want to talk about.
Questions from anyone? I'll start with one, and maybe this is a little too early, but just wondering what the timing or the sequencing is of the different funding pieces. By not going to referendum round, you're able to start spending on design of the project now, so I presume spending down some fund balance is imminent, but on the timing of issuing debt or timing of funding from the foundation, where things are at.
Nothing really has changed. A timeline is outlined with the key trigger. So yes, the work will begin. The work begins by engaging our architecture firm, et cetera, to do the work to get down to design bids and such, right? And that will go for the next 20 months, Greg.
Well, we plan to go out to bid for the project in early mid-fall, late October-ish. So all the design phase CCND is going to be hopefully completed throughout the summer, allowing us to go for bid in the fall. And then as far as the various debt mechanisms, we haven't had any or for the certificates themselves, we haven't had a concrete timeline for when we would issue various debts for obvious reasons, right? There's no need to spend at that level at all at this point. But more importantly, our team just needs to sit down and figure that out. So Sid, do you want to add more color commentary to that general answer?
I actually spoke with Elizabeth Hennessy, and we will be setting up some meetings
Yep.
to decide what is going to be left for the district and for the debt and interest rates and everything like that.
I guess a couple other tidbits related to your question, Steve. Because the other part is the hiring of a construction firm, so you can, the timing, but I want to talk to part of that as it would relate to this group, so timing.
Yeah, we are in negotiations right now with SCM for the project. And we hope to have that done before we wrap up for summer, for this semester. So in the next few weeks, we'll have that nailed down. And that's an important process that we have to have that in place and help have them to consult with for the completion of the design for the project.
And so I would say there's a couple elements of that I think have been touched on by this group over, in dialogue, which is what type of contractual arrangement, making sure that we get into a not to exceed type arrangement from a project standpoint, and making sure we negotiate something that is clearly ensure as best as possible that we stay within the dollars that we anticipated. Structure that contract in a way that it does have.
So it sounds like that decision will be made shortly on the debt side. Do you envision needing to come back to the committee with any pieces that relate to that?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question one more time?
I'm just wondering if you'll need committee input on anything as you get further along in the debt issuance front.
We might. We need to sit down and have preliminary conversations first. Cindy, do you want to?
Correct, I think we have to put a schedule together, and then at that point, we can bring it to the committee once that's done. I think we just need to see what it looks like first, so we need to have that initial meeting.
We're going to be playing obviously a bit of an interest rate game here.
Right.
Yeah, and structure, our next agenda item is the charge of the committee, and structure of that is one of the pieces that is on there, so.
Yes, I think that once as we get to that time, the more we can get feedback from the committee, the better we'll make. So.
Anyone else have questions for Mr. Kopsky about the board's plan project? Then our next agenda item is the charge of the committee. Just wanted to review this. I think the last time we put about before he came on to the committee. So just we've been so project too focused the last 6 months or so, wanted to reevaluate kind of everything else that falls under our purview, which includes debt, investment management, we have spent time on policy work, financial projections, and so on and so forth. The one I wanted to point out is the second bullet point on the back page 13 of the packet, is review the district's evidence-based funding model and provide input on resource allocation. When Cindy and Greg and I met 3 weeks ago via Zoom to talk about this meeting, that was sort of where I wanted to regroup and refocus us in anticipation of our next meeting being 2024 budget conversation. Is talking about resource allocation a little bit here. Did anyone have any questions about the committee charges? You looked at it in the packet. Great, you're fine, awesome. Then moving on to 4C. This is the District 200 allocations and funding. The first piece of that is mine. I just took a handful of slides from a presentation I've done a number of times at the annual school board conference for Illinois ASBO on the evidence-based funding model and kind of how that works to give a little bit of background for the second piece of that agenda item for the administration to present how they look at their allocations of resources in relation to the evidence-based funding model. So I'm just going to run through these slides real quickly. I won't hit every bullet point, but just wanted to give you some background. There's a multi-year process that led to this change in the school funding formula in 2017. The previous general state aid formula had been around for many decades. It was based on a single, what they call the foundation level, a single per student dollar amount that was the same no matter if you were in Zion or Cairo or anywhere in between in the state. And then just a certain percentage of that was funded locally with property taxes, and the state made up the difference. So over a multi-year process, we came up with the evidence-based funding formula that passed in summer of 2017. At the time, we had a Republican governor, so there were some compromises that were made to get Republican support for it. Many of which are still under conversation in Springfield now. That the Democrats have full control. But just kind of talk about some of the basics and some of the changes and how they kind of change the formulas. The new formula uses enrollment as opposed to attendance. There used to be a big focus on tracking attendance throughout the year. The state auditor would come out and review your attendance tracking. Now it's based on enrollment and it's averaged across a couple different points in the year. The big change fundamentally is that every district has a different target now instead of that flat foundation level for everyone. Everyone has an adequacy target that's based on their student demographics. And so a district with higher percentage of students in poverty or higher students, they're English language learners, they'll have a higher target because they need greater resources to deliver that level of education for the students. There is what's called the comparable wage index, which tries to also provide a different target based on where the state of district is. It's not foolproof. It ended up getting caps that sort of brought down the impact of high salaries in the northeast corner of the state a bit. But there are, in the end, there still is a factor that inflates the adequacy target for districts in Cook County and the surrounding areas here.
Steve, if you could, the magnitude of that between, so here, I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think
Like
there's a study, and I believe it's out of university in the south, like, can't remember where it's from, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, maybe, but go on that. But they had a range of wages. And it was some ratio from something like 0.8 to 1.15 or something like that across the state. But they put a floor in of 1.0, and so all the districts that were sort of under the average get to use the average, and then the districts that are over the average, like the suburban ones, do get that extra bump on the state average. But the districts that pay lower, that are in other parts of the state, don't get that reduced factor calculation, if I remember correctly. The key that they got the support across the board in the state was that there was a base funding minimum that said whatever you got last year is your base for this year. No district lost money. There was a lot of concern that it was going to be some sort of Robin Hood type of rich districts would have to keep the poor, or rich and poor, and that was not the case. And so going forward, again, you're never getting less than what you had the year before, regardless of how the variables in the formula might be changing your data. And then there is still a local offset based on property taxes and person property replacement taxes that determine how much you have to contribute locally. There are some. Sorry,
Hate to interrupt, but I want to recognize Mr. Henry joining them.
Mr. Henry.
With the energy here.
Thank you. There are some nuances that are different here on the local tax calculation also, but that's beyond tonight's conversation. My next slide was just a chart of state funding, over the last decade or so. 2018 fiscal year was the first change of the new formula. A lot of special ed funding rolled in the new formula. So that's why the orange piece got a lot smaller and the blue part jumped up. The old special ed formulas were much more resource allocation based. So if you had more special ed teachers, you got more special ed funding for teachers, even if you didn't necessarily need them. And this is much more based on the actual demographics of your student population and your special ed needs. And so since that funding change, funding has gone up pretty well each year in Illinois. But it's been very targeted to the districts that are furthest from the adequacy target. So what we call tier 1 districts are the ones furthest from adequacy. And they've seen the vast bulk of the increases over the last 6 years. And that's going to continue going forward. Again, redirecting the vast majority of new money to the districts most in need. And that's sort of illustrated on the tier slide. Follow there, so 50% of new funding goes to tier 1 districts who are 65% or less of their target per student. And then tier 2 gets 49%, and tier 1 is included in that group also. So really 99% of new money goes to districts that are below adequacy, target of 90%. And then tier 3 gets a little bit, if you're over your adequacy target already, you're really getting more than the pennies new dollars. So we're sitting here in a tier 4 district that hasn't gotten any significant increases in funding. One of the pieces that was added at the last minute to get the Republican votes was property tax relief grants, and so that's something that the Oak Park community has benefited from. I forget city year which fiscal year that was. Second year. Right? So districts that via the formula become eligible for the tax relief grant have to reduce their taxes through an abatement, and they get the percentage of the difference made up via increased state funding. So those are some of the factors that drive the evidence-based funding. The key piece though is the evidence-based practice portion of it.
Steve, on that slide that has the tier 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Just the percentage of districts and students that fall into those buckets, do you know?
You could easily look it up on the
Yeah,
website. I know off the top of my head, I don't know it. There's definitely benefit for districts from tier 1 to tier 2 since the formula was created, which was the goal of directing the dollars that way, but beyond that, I don't know that.
Yeah, I know we recently looked at Ralph shared an article that he was involved in that had a lot of data on
The efficacy of the.
and more talking about the economics and the dollars that have shifted and the number of students. So there's a good article that it would be, I think, beneficial if anybody wanted to read it, just to get a handle on it. My recall is that, we're in tier 4, which is greater than 100%, and that represents maybe 10% of the students are in that particular bucket.
Yeah, I was gonna say 100 in some districts, but not on a student count basis.
Yeah.
I don't know what.
So that report has it by student, how many students are in each bucket, as well as how many districts, but it's really about students.
And Chicago recently moved from tier 1 to tier 2.
Yes, which that's evident in the report, as it changed the whole landscape. It kind of gets it might be beneficial if we can get that article just to share, because it is it just
There we go.
the test.
That's it.
This is the third time they've done that since 4:30 today, so it might happen another time before we close.
Um. So the key piece to this new model,
I just said it, so.
What are my questions? The evidence-based factors that determine that adequacy target for each district is what District 200 here is using as a way to benchmark their resource allocation. So I wanted to walk through the remainder of my slides here. It's kind of a summary I put together for this presentation of all the key factors that are used to determine those adequacy targets. So the first page is all ratios of staff to students. So it starts out with teacher-student ratios, and they're different at different age levels, and then they're different depending on the makeup of your demographics when it comes to low-income students. So if you were in a district, if District 200 was a high school district with no low-income students, you'd be allocated enough dollars for a 25-to-1 teacher ratio. If you have 100% low income, it would be 20-to-1, and because you're somewhere in between, your allocation is going to be somewhere between 25 and 20 kids per teacher. Then they add at the high school level 33% more FTE for teachers outside of the core classes. So this is for your fine arts, PE, and health, and the like.
Attention, please. This is the time. I repeat, this is only a time. Thank you.
And then you also have FTE allocations for instructional facilitators, and intervention teachers, substitute costs, and guidance counselors at the ratio of 250 to 1.
Thank you.
The next page then gets into all of the support FTEs. We have allocations for nurses, aides, librarians, library aides, media techs, principal, assistant principal, and school site staff. So that's like school office support staff. The goal of this was to come up with what does it cost to deliver a program that based on academic evidence leads to high student performance. And so that's why class size is a key piece of this, and smaller class sizes if you have more low income students, etc. And then, so that's the key staff piece. Then there's some per student allocations for additional dollars for targeted things. So like gifted programming, professional development, instructional materials, additional local assessments on top of the state mandated assessments, technology. Those tier 1, tier 2 districts get extra allocations for technology because they're often playing catch up to try to get to 1-to-1 ratios with devices and things like that. And then you can see, lastly, there's a especially at the high school level, a large allocation for student activities, given the size of the extracurricular programs with clubs and sports at the high school level. Then some of the back end sports services, there's allocations for operations and maintenance, maintain your buildings, allocation for central office, for administrators and business office and all those other areas. And then there's an allocation of benefits that's 30% of salary. So now we've got a building, we can maintain it, we can staff it, we've got a district administration team to oversee it. And lastly, then we're going to add some additional supports. And so this is where we really get a different adequacy target for each district based on their demographics, because for the districts that are high poverty or high EL or both, there's going to be additional allocations for those students for interventions, pupil supports, extended school days, summer school, and English language learners. So for every 125 or 120 students, they're going to get an additional FTE to be deployed in all of those special areas. On the next page, additional allocations for special ed, special education teachers, psychologists, and aides as well. And so all of that kind of rolls into then a target of funding from the state, but then it can also be a benchmark for, are we allocating our resources the way the evidence says we're going to get positive outcomes for our students. And so I will happily answer any questions about formula, or you turn it over. To the districts, let them kind of walk through their adequacy target gap analysis calculator.
Yes.
I guess I do have
Sure.
one question, so with all with staffing, can you explain, or maybe explain again about how the wage differentials in different areas are handled?
Sure, so. The first step would be looking at the district student count. And then calculating the number of FTE that based on that student count would be necessary to staff at that level. And then, and across all these areas, they look at statewide averages and then it gets indexed by the wage index. So if the statewide average teacher salary is 50,000, but Cook County has a wage index of 1.05, then we'd have an extra 5% on top of that times the FTE based on the district's ratio. And so that would be the allocation for teacher salaries. And then divided by enrollment is the percent, there's the amount of the adequacy target for that single item.
Yeah, I would say there's a listing by job. So, I mean, it would be, a classroom teacher, but there would be, I'm just trying to think of for all the different classes of employment, there's a statewide, benchmark.
Okay.
So I'll just say, let's just say a classroom teacher is $75,000, for example purposes only. And then they may say a nurse is $58,000, whatever. So there's a listing that's there, and then, as Steve said, then there's a multiplier because of region.
That's based on county by county. And then there's actually a appointed group, it needs to be called the professional review panel. This consists of educators, practitioners, board members, and I think some legislators and other interested citizens that reviews the full formula every year, talks about, should we adjust this factor? Are we allocating everything that we should? And there's been very minimal changes in the first, half dozen years or so here, but there's continually conversations of does the formula calculate the way we wanted to, and suggest the resource allocations the way they should be.
Thank you.
I have a question. Does the state audit then how the schools use the money? Or
No,
they're
thank you for
free to
asking
do
that.
it?
So there was very much when this bill passed, concern from school districts that, well, now we're gonna have to spend a certain way and we're losing local control over decisions. And it was made very clear that, no one of these elements is prioritized as the most important one first. So like if you get extra money, it's not, you have to lower class size first, or you have to hire more special teachers first. It's very much flexible, with the exception being some of the special ed and English learner dollars that need to be shown that you're allocated to those specific groups. But across all of the core elements, it doesn't say, class size is more important than guidance counselor ratio than psychologist ratio or things like that. So there's still very much local control. There is a little bit of reporting. I think it's like a 1-page tab in the budget file where you can kind of say how you've allocated your money, and that's really the extent of it.
And I would say that the first couple of years, there was nothing in terms of even a tool to kind of use. We actually built our own, just kind of recreated it, and now that tool is available publicly, where basically it's the model, it's a spreadsheet, and you just plug in your information, and that's what we're gonna be seeing today. So what we're seeing today, we home built until we got it to the state.
So we try to stick to it in some way or another then within the school?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that you'll see when we go through our calculator is the ways in which there are variances, some of which are by design because of values of this community or missions of the school, things we want to make sure we accomplish. And also, I think I've heard this explained to me through sessions that I've attended as a superintendent with others throughout the state. The research that and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the research that was kind of pulled together to help to create this formula is really best understood at the local level, at the school level, as kind of a descriptive analysis of what works in schools, and it shouldn't be misinterpreted as a prescriptive how-to methodology, right? And so the biggest, a really clear way to illustrate that is on one of the slides. It references the student to principal ratio that it's recommending of 600 students for every principal. So that would mean here at OPRF, if we follow that prescriptively, we would have somewhere between 5 and 6 principals in the school, which doesn't work, right, for how a principal actually works. And so as a result, when we think about the job responsibilities that our principals have, we kind of analyze the allocation of different administrative roles kind of collectively. So when you take a look at principal, assistant principal, some of the school site staff, if you take a look at those all together, you realize that those actually together kind of generally fit what the student to administrative ratio is identified to be. Like in this school, for example, I'll just illustrate that a little more concretely. Our division heads in all of our various, academic areas, they do a lot of the evaluating, if not all the evaluating for teachers within that area. Well, in school, I think one of the responsibilities that is presumed in the research that principals are the ones doing that. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Any other questions?
I have one more. So on the slide with the tier distribution, just so I understand what the numbers mean. So like that, in the tier 1 schools, then that would mean their actual budget is less than or equal to 65% of what the budget should be based on the formula.
So the adequacy targets are all a per student target, and so, yeah, their per student spend, and again, it's not total budget, but it's the portion that's funded through EVF. So like some of the things that aren't included in this formula are transportation and early childhood pre-K programs, and so they would look at their per student spending excluding those set asides, and they're spending at a level that's 65% or less of the target the formula generates based on their demographics.
And it's the spending per student, not the state funding per student.
Spending, correct. Yeah, and then once you determine that target and there's a gap there, that's what's going to determine the state funding pieces. The districts that are further from their target are going to get a bigger bump towards getting them to the target. Originally, when this passed, it was supposed to be a 10-year path to getting everyone to 90% of adequacy, because this is only looking at local and state funding, and roughly on average, state federal funding is 10%. So if we can get state and local funding to 90% of adequacy, federal will make up the difference, and everybody should be at an adequate level. But due to inflation, there was 1 year where there was no additional funding to the formula because of COVID, and so on. We're still many more years away from getting everybody to adequacy.
And to kind of put numbers on that, and again, I'm just going, I think 85% of the students are below 90% adequacy. So
85% of the state.
85% of the state is below 100%. We're at 138%. And there's a series of districts in this collar area of Chicago that go probably as high as 180 or thereabouts %. So you've got, the quite a bit of disparity within the state of Illinois.
And that's driven by the local tax revenues.
Yep.
Thank you.
Cindy, want to do the spreadsheet?
So, on the spreadsheet, if you look at what happens in the beginning of the year, there's 33 categories, and in those 33 categories, 27 of them are staffing, and the other 6 are student investments. Brian will talk a little bit about student investments. And Roxanne will talk a little bit about how our staffing actually gets categorized here in a few minutes. But I'll start off with I'm gonna start off with core teachers and just walk through that a little bit. So to look at that, what you're looking at is they actually give us an adequacy target, which is the number of teachers we should have as core teachers. And then they also put in the dollar amount, and Steve spoke about earlier, there is a comparable wage index. So we are actually after the regionalization, that's actually ours there. Then we put in our actual spend and then what the difference is. So if we look at core teachers, they recommend that we should have 139.7, and we actually have 139.6. The other is the fact that we should spend $11.5 million and we've spent 15.4. That does not mean that we are overpaying. The one thing that happens in here too is you have to look at longevity of teachers staying in classrooms too, and increases that happen in bargaining union contracts that also happen. So that's a little bit of the difference that happens in all of that. So just giving the example, like I said, the core teacher, the difference, Tom has already pointed out too, that this district is at 138%. So we're 38% above. So it also makes us tier 4 because we're over the 100%. That's the accuracy. So with that, I'm going to let Brian, if you want to talk about the student investments.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. The student investments are a little bit different in the sense that they're not necessarily tied to a direct staffing number. Most of these items get pulled from our actual spending and or our budget, depending on what time of year we're kind of putting together these EBF numbers. A lot of the categories you see here, such as professional development, instructional materials, employee benefits, they all have specific accounting code digits within the state's guidelines for how to do accounting for school districts. So a lot of those are very easy numbers to just kind of pull from the budget that gets approved each year and or our general ledger for actual spending. The computer and tech equipment and assessments, those are two categories that tend to be spread a little bit more widely throughout the budget, because you will see some of those items spent in a number of divisions or departments within our district. So those take a little bit more kind of number crunching to pull out those exact expenditures to report in here. But we do have a tool that I use that kind of defines where we're getting those different expenses from, so that we have consistency from year to year in the numbers that get reported in here.
Thank you. Probably have
Sure. So every year we report all of our employees, and sometimes categories could be a little bit challenging to determine whether each employee falls. Just to give you an example, for instance, nurses. So the definition of the category is licensed school nurse, which means it's an individual who has a professional educator license with a certified nurse endorsement. So we have 2, but we report 3 because we also have a registered nurse who performs basically all the functions of a nurse in the school, with the exception of IEP. They're not allowed to participate in IEPs because they don't have a professional educator license. So every year I've look at the list of all employees in all employee groups and do an initial assessment where in what category each employee should be categorized. Then it goes to standing for review, and then we take it to the district leadership team, because there are still some categories where we struggle where they should fall. Like for instance, we have the supervisory aid, which primarily should be campus safety. employees. But we also have, in our student resource center, for instance, we have monitors that we feel like should be in that category, and we had that we have that discussion every time we bring some staffing changes to the board, so we explain what employees are in the category and if there's a difference between what evidence-based funding suggests we should have in the category and what we actually have. We provide an explanation of why and who exactly is categorized. But
Thank you. So that raises a question for me to the board members. Do you look at this as, does this inform budgetary decisions or staffing decisions then to some extent?
Yes.
Maybe you could just sort of describe how the process works.
So what is, we have a strategic plan that identifies what is important to the district. So that's kind of the qualitative aspect. So, and then we have a staffing plan, how do we apply our resources? So the goal is, and as I said earlier, we're well resourced. Okay, and coming to your question, is it our goal? And are we saying, no, we need to be at 100% adequacy? No, absolutely not. We are a well-resourced district, and we want to provide our students, with that. But this then allows us to say, is the spend in alignment with what our strategic directions are, right? And what we want to do. And if you look at it and really kind of benchmark it, compare it to it, you can say, wait a second, if overall we're at 138%, but we're at 190% in instructional materials. I just picked that out of the list, right? That says that either A, we have a strategic differentiator where we're saying we really want to emphasize instructional materials as a district because we think it's core to our mission. Or it says that we're out of alignment with what evidence says. And so how do we then realign that over time? I think as a board member, the administration knows the resources. For us to sit and say, you need to change this person for that person, that's their job, not the board. But for us to say, let's balance and make sure this is the resources we have, and we need to make sure we're getting the value out of them. And so it gives us kind of a benchmarking capability. Does that answer your question?
yes,
And I think for me, it gives us, when there's new staffing requests or security, whatever it is, we know that there's funding available, right? So it's the ask is from the administration want to add people or staff. That show where they're going to bounce from, right? So to Tom's point, if you have a resource in another area that you could take that funding from that, should do so. That's why it's not as static. Recently asked for more security personnel, which is fine, as long as we figure out where we can take our allocation from different parts. So one thing I just want to point out, and there's no oversight on employee benefits. I think there was an error there because the difference, the delta is the same as the spend.
Oh, yeah, we did change that. This came from the board meeting. This
Yeah.
just came directly from-
And that
yeah, I
$12
did
million
change that.
number is in here. Yeah, and to kind of put back on Sabrina's question, one of the asks is when we are asked for resources, this is one of the reference materials that is part of the ask. So if they come and say, I want more instructional materials, and we're at 190%, and there better be a good argument of why we want that. And I can tell you as a board member, prior to having this tool, everything sounded good, right? I mean, emotionally, Johnny needs more instructional materials, and it sounds good because you really had no indication of where we compared to anything that was science-based. So now it's science-based, recognizing that we are not the same as any other district in this state. We have 3,400 students in one building. It's a high school that's different than a 600 student K through 8 school in a smaller town in southern Illinois. So, but it at least allows us to ask the question from a comparative standpoint as we are asked for resources.
Would it be helpful to run through all of these real quickly, or is that more detail than the committee's interested in? I was, I think, coming in as expecting to see more things, like, oh wow, that surprised me, and there really weren't a lot on the FTE side. For the most part, things are really in line with what the model suggests, and a lot of the differences on the expense side are due to salaries being higher than the average plus the wage index adjustment. And as was mentioned, that's partly because the wage index just doesn't adjust fully, but it's also a matter of demographics too. This doesn't take into account anywhere according to the age of your staff and where they're at in your salary schedule. And so two identical districts with identical salary schedules could have very different cost per student just because of that.
Yeah, and if you take core teacher, just as someone was asking, if you take the the adequacy target after reallocate. Regionalization, yeah, my glasses are, my eyes, that it shows that we get 5.7%
on
top of the average. So that's how much we get. And if you look at it, and we are at overall, our head count is perfectly online, and we're 34% above that, even with the 5.7%. So it says that it's all based on what the per FTE is here for that one line item, just in reading.
Well, maybe rather than going through it item by item, sort of the question out to the board members or administrators, are there certain areas within these elements that you're currently targeting as areas that you feel like you're over allocated that you want to adjust, or areas where you would like to be directing additional resources?
I'll start off the conversation there. If you go to the second page, pretty much dead center on the page, you'll see that computer and tech equipment is funded really more than 200% of what the agency target is after adjusting for the regionalization factor. There are some efficiencies that we are in the process of really narrowing in, identifying that will need to be rolled out over time to help, bring that back within a place that's more consistent with the rest of this entire sheet. I want to be clear, when we talk about these things too, it's not like we want to start getting rid of these things, and having more of one thing is necessarily a bad thing, but for a variety of reasons that have been identified recently, we've seen the computer tech area needs some efficiencies, so we're working on that.
My recollection is that that piece hasn't changed since this rolled out 6 years ago. It did well. No, how that element is calculated, and it did not envision one. I don't think it allocates one-to-one devices to everyone, and so I think that's an area that the PRP has been reviewing of maybe we need to adjust that allocation because it doesn't account for the reality of how we're currently delivering tech.
Yeah.
It's
Yes, I think that's fair. I think that's accurate, and that's why we would still be likely certainly well above 100% when we're done, I'm sure. Unless they adjust it and it matches up really neatly, but I think there are still deficiencies there that we need to target over time.
So we had discussion, so we heard about was it supervisory aides includes our security.
That's right.
And staff, so that one, we actually, is this number here reflective of the recent additions?
Yes.
What is?
That's what they're open to. Yeah, which is them. Yeah.
So they're actually, that's one where we're,
Wait, hold on, I don't, Cindy, I wanna interrogate that just for a moment. This is the exact spreadsheet that we shared with the board when we were doing the staffing requests for those items. And so it was a description of where we were, based off of data from, you know, prior to the addition of those FTE. So, no, they have not been added in.
so that's one where we're over, we actually added resources. Part of the dialogue, and when it was brought forth, was we run a 24, you know, we're not a 8-hour-a-day operation here. We have a, what?
I said, that's true.
We have a significant amount of resource that's here on second shift and third shift, et cetera. So there were, you know, I would say there were uniquenesses or circumstances, not uniquenesses, where what was in the formula did not, you know, did not fully match what we're doing. And so that was part of the rationale.
Any other questions or comments about any of the elements in this analysis? Absent the times where you're looking to add resources, is there a time of year where the board typically reviews this? I guess I'm just trying to look forward. Is there a time in our calendar where we should typically review this? We brought it now just because we hadn't gotten to it yet in our year plus since we were formed, but going forward, is there a good time of year to be looking at this benchmark? I guess I don't know when it needs to be put out there spreadsheet with the data so that you can then.
It's varied a little bit.
Okay.
They usually get it out September, October.
Using
And-
current data.
And then we start putting ours together, and it probably takes us about two months to go through it. So it's January about when we start, January, February. And then normally we want to use this prior to when we start making recommendations to the board. That's usually.
Or staffing, but
Yeah, exactly.
makes sense.
But we also use it on ongoing basis. It's just, the last committee of the whole, there was a stipend recommendation for next year, and we looked at how we compare to the evidence-based funding in terms of student experience. So like, if you look now, there is relatively speaking, big increase that we are asking for, it's about $43,000, but EPF shows that we are understanding for student experience. We always like, if there is a financial ask, we try to find.
Sure. But I think your timing is, you know, January, February,
Makes sense.
you know, where. This year it's later because other things, but it would probably be about 2 months earlier than 2 to 3 months earlier than right now.
Yeah, how often is the district strategy reviewed, and how long is it like a 3-year strategy, a 5-year strategy?
Strategic plan.
Strategic plan. So, we do little adjustments to that every year, right, based off of needs that might come up. In fact, we're in the midst of one right now. But the priorities, like the main priorities for the strategic plan were first identified for the 17-18 school year. And those priorities have not changed. Some of the activities we've accomplished, and so we've moved on to other things within each of those priorities. But I would say there's a general, like every year we assess it to see what have we accomplished and what do we need to add to this business. But the overall scope and frame of it has not changed since 17-18 school year. And that's fairly common. I was just talking to superintendents in this region, and we talked about it. Like a strategic plan kind of is a decade-long thing, so a 10-year thing. You put that in place, and you obviously make adjustments every year. But you want to hold on to those long-term goals for a big chunk of time.
Any other questions or comments? Our last agenda item then is talk about future agenda.
Is there anything, I know this is a lot to say, but is there anything that you might need, right? That's not here, that would be helpful from your perspective. It's not on the sheet.
Not as it relates to the EBF, one of the other things that we had talked about before we went this direction was just staffing in general and maybe looking at a longer staffing history to understand some of the decisions that were made within this framework in recent years. And I think that's something that's probably in the budget or audit documents that we could use as a starting point. But yeah, that's kind of transitioning to what I want to talk about, future agenda items, was really throwing it out to the group on where else. I kind of picked this one because it was something that I was interested in, but I really like everyone to kind of weigh in and kind of, again, through the lens of our charge. Are there areas you'd like to see us visit? We have not into investment management at all in this incarnation of the committee. You know, I think that we just scheduled the June meeting. Lisa sent that out the other day. That's going to be focused on the tentative budget. But in kind of planning for the rest of this year, where our interests lie, I guess.
Steve, may I add something really quick?
Absolutely.
Maybe a little preceding the future agenda item topic, so if this is helpful, and it really goes along with, I think, Roxanna's comment or Cindy's comments about how we use this, not only how we refresh it once a year prior to staffing discussions, but how we are in the midst of monitoring the use of this on an annual basis for the purposes of policy 712, which is our racial equity policy that was passed a few years back. Dr. Applewhite is here, just because we wanted to throw this out there, and we don't know if there would be any questions, but we, part of that policy calls for a resource allocation review, very much in line with the fundamental core of why EDF was designed, to make sure that we are applying our funds to students and general school needs that traditionally have been underserved. So our when we have a series of program reviews that we bring to the board every calendar year, and what we've kind of finally gotten to a point where we're able to stand up that resource allocation process. And so when we are bringing those types of items, whether we're talking about our title funding, whether we're talking about our extracurricular funding and our sports and clubs, or whatever it may be, part of the analysis that we want to make sure we're always bringing forward is, this is how much we're spending for these for these types of programming. Here's who these programs are serving. Generally overall, gross aggregate numbers, but also disaggregated. And here's kind of the bang for the buck that we're getting as a result. And we'll take a look at that individually within the school, but also, of course, contextualized within EBF. Where possible, just anytime you're talking about specific school programs, in the context of EBF, there's always this element potentially of a square peg around hole, right? Because of how that goes, but still, it really helps us to kind of zero in on whether we're instituting practices that are likely to bring about the results we want to see. So it's not just an annual basis; it's an annual review. And so Dr. Applewhite and her team have developed, or in the process of formalizing, I suppose, it's technically still in draft form. We haven't totally nailed it down with everybody, but an annual calendar for those program reviews. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I wanted to make sure you provided that context.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at this is the outputs of the process, right? The inputs are how many students, right? And then what percent non-English or low income, non-English, and special ed. So that demographic data is what drives our resource requirements and where they should be according to that.
So again, I guess next month's agenda will be Senate budget. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or areas of interest, kind of just in building up our knowledge base of school finance topics in general going forward. We can certainly do like we did today, and more of a presentation and learning in other areas as well. We'll have a new administrators coming on shortly too. Certainly weigh in on some stuff. I guess I'm not sure what you're doing on the facilities side with that. Role,
Position?
yeah, since we're on that, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, so, well, as far as this committee is concerned, our new assistant superintendent for legal services will be here July 1, officially in the district, and operations will report to that role from here on out. And so Ron's exact role, our executive director of operations, as it existed, is not going to be replaced with a simple, plug in place. We did shift some of the roles of that position over to an assistant principal of operations. But that's really more focused on internal in-building operational needs. Think things like safety, security, and consistency of dean implementation, things along those lines. Parts of that were under Ron's charge previously, but Ron also was big picture district-wide work as well. That's all gonna fall under the assistant superintendent for business services. So, his involvement in this committee moving forward will replace both Cindy's current involvement and Ron's previous involvement.
No further questions or comments, I think. Take a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Who had the first?
You.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
who's gonna take one?
I was looking for one, but I
I
can move. I never get to move. I'll move to be adjourned. I have the second, all in favor.